Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a good week so far. We are in week 5. This week, we're talking about role playing, gaming, and digital communities. Your first reading this week, called Make Believe and Make Belief in Second Life and Role Playing Communities, is written by Maria Bach, who is at I'm going to say this completely wrong, Jönköping University in Malmö, Sweden. And she is the head of communication culture and diversity research environment, which is like an institute, and also the program director for their master's program in learning, digitization, and sustainability, referred to as LEADS, and is herself also a researcher both in academia and outside of. In her article, Make Believe and Make Belief in Second Life Role-Playing Communities, Bach uses the method of cyber ethnography, sometimes also called digital ethnography, which includes interviews and participant observation, which all of you will be doing, and textual analysis, which a lot of you also, it seems like you'll be doing based on the conversations I've been having with you about what it is you're looking at following as far as sites. Textual analysis is when you are tracking what it is that people are saying and looking for certain kinds of patterns and coding that for certain kinds of meanings. And we'll talk more about that as we start to prep for your final projects. And what she's really looking at are the ways that users engage through the Second Life avatars and characters that they're creating in the spaces that they're also building. So the theory that she's utilizing to help her understand what she's looking at is this concept of make believe and make believe, which comes from Richard Schechner. And she's using that concept to look at these two different communities in the 3D environment of Second Life. One is called Midian City and the other is Gore, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But before we do, I want to kind of briefly just talk about what Schechner's talking about that she's borrowing from. So Richard Schechner is a professor of performance studies, and he's actually foundational to the existence of the field and started the program at NYU. What performance studies does is it applies concepts from theater and dramaturgy and the ways that meaning is created in those kinds of spaces and looks at other spaces in real life. So it uses those kinds of concepts to understand what we're doing in real life. A good example of some of this, so Erving Goffman is a sociologist and is not a performance studies guy, but if you think back to some of the stuff that he's talking about the performance of the self in everyday life, Goffman's ideas have been really important to a lot of people who ended up doing work in performance studies, and so definitely connects to a lot of what we're seeing here. So just to go through this concept of make-believe versus make-belief and how they overlap. Make-believe, I think probably we all are very familiar with. This is putting on a costume, getting on a stage, pretending to be someone. And there's a kind of quote unquote suspension of disbelief, right? Everyone is sort of in on the fact that this is a time period where we're sort of setting aside time to believe in this fiction or this fantasy, whether that's watching a film or acting in a play, or if any of you have ever played role-playing games, you are choosing to be in these kinds of spaces where you are performing an identity other than your own. And in doing so, we sort of accept that this is real in its own context, right? So there are different rules within the space of the make-believe. Make-believe is a term that Schechner introduces to emphasize broader, more dynamic concepts. And this extends beyond the traditional boundaries of theater and other kinds of spaces where we would know we were playing make-believe, right? Where we are conscious that we are making believe. And instead, what he's talking about are spaces where this enters into everyday life. And he talks a lot about this in terms of different kinds of rituals and different kinds of procedures and practices. So he's really big on thinking about this in relationship to spiritual practice and religion. But there's lots of spaces that we see make-belief happen. So one of them actually is college, right? For instance, education spaces are a big part of this. The way that a space is set up in a classroom where there's one teacher at the front of the room and a bunch of desks, and those are the students are in them, and it sets up the professor or the teacher as the person with the kind of specialized knowledge, and it sets up all of the students as there to gather information. It also creates a hierarchy of value. We do this in political spaces, right? Where we engage in things that are based in ritual and a collective idea about performing things in a particular way, in part because it's just the accepted story of how it goes, right? And so a lot of what was going on when Schechner was doing this work in the 1960s, or he started to kind of begin doing this work, was young people in the 60s were really thinking about all of the ways that society was making them perform in these rituals that felt absurd. It felt wrong. So for them, it was often those questions of patriotism in the context of the Vietnam War. That was really problematic for a lot of young people. And so you saw a lot of anti-war movements that were really about kind of critiquing, holding up of the ideal of America as a moral good. And people challenging those ideas. And we see a lot of this happening today in different ways too. Arguably, we are at a point now where we have like simultaneously a great deal of make belief going on, of people being really susceptible to things like conspiracy communities that we'll get into further like down the road in the semester, but that also people are deeply suspicious of the rituals that have previously existed. So we're kind of in a crisis of make belief, I think, in a lot of ways. But it's important for you to understand this kind of overlap and tension between the space where it's like we're all conscious that we're playing, that we're pretending, and the spaces where we are going through sort of ritualized activities and practices that in and of themselves are also creating realities and creating rules and structures in society that yet are still based on similar performative structures of rituals and theatricality, but they're part of our everyday existences. Shetner's a fun read. So one of the things that Backe is using Schechner to talk about is the way that role play as a performative utopia is an environment of dreams created by actors as visual and social realization of their ideals. And it's dependent for its maintenance upon the community's acceptance and cooperation, right? What that means is that everybody has to kind of continually sign on to play make-believe together, right? If you stop doing that, it stops functioning. In the same way that, like, if you were to go to a play and somebody sort of disrupts the whole system of, like, we sit in the theater, we watch the people on the stage. If you've ever been anywhere where that's ever been disrupted, if you've ever been part of something like that, it's once that kind of distinction gets broken and the we're all doing this together is shattered, it's really hard to get it back into place. And so this is what she's saying is also critical to something like Second Life's working. And if you've watched already a short little video that I gave you guys on Utopia 1.0 about both Second Life and some other utopian spaces, you'll see that like what she's sort of looking at is what happens when that community's acceptance and cooperation sort of breaks down and the maintenance of the space of the ideal stops functioning, and what happens when that becomes kind of abandoned. So she's interested in this relational aspect of role playing. So it's not just an individual representing themselves, they're representing themselves in community, and that community needs to recognize them in a particular way and requires a kind of collaboration to function. And again, check that out and see how that plays out in that video after the point of this breakdown. Her film is kind of a like lonely meditation on the abandoned collective space when like no one's playing anymore, right? No one's really holding up that kind of sense of collective community. No one's holding up that collaboration anymore. And certainly, like, Second Life is far from over. There are still YouTubers putting out videos on like how to do certain kinds of role playing things, how to mod your characters, how to do all of these things. It's not completely defunct, right? But it's just in the same way that we talked in the first week about how the internet was imagined to be a kind of utopian space, that there was this sense of hope, the possibility of what could happen there. There similarly was a sense of hope about this kind of space. And certainly it was like fictional, but it was also this idea that like the world could be created as one wished, right? And so this is what it used to look like, right? You could play for free originally when it first started, and it was a world building game. So there was this sense that you could kind of create the spaces around you. And that was really the entire objective. It was created in 2003 by the San Francisco based tech company called Linden Lab. And because it was this user-generated world, it wasn't thought of and wasn't thought of necessarily as a game. I know we're looking at it in a week on gaming, but it wasn't framed as a game in the traditional sense because there were no predetermined rules or goals. Like there was no way to win or lose, right? It was just kind of, or at least that's the way it seemed at first, that it was just a space where people were kind of creating things together. And so in the video, you'll see like people made galleries and they made, somebody has a sailing class, all kinds of things that people wanted to do, maybe couldn't do in their real life, or for whatever reason that they found particularly interesting to do in this space, they did. They created these kinds of parallel realities for themselves. and would create avatars in order to participate in it. And it was run by Linden dollars, which were exchangeable for real dollars. And that has some impacts later down the road. So the user base grew really steadily into the 2010s with over 1 million active. And then by 2017, the base had started to decline. And to embolden the virtual economy in 2019, Linden Lab created Telia, a registered money service business and fully licensed money transmitter. So kind of crypto dollar, essentially, in a way. It was based in blockchain. In short, in order for the space to stay viable, it had to undergo financialization. And a lot of what starts to happen with this is you end up in a situation where then, as our sort of dreamy guide in the video, Utopia 1.0 at the end talks about, there is this sense that people had in this kind of hopefulness that they could create something that was different. And in the end, what ends up happening is it ends up being a reproduction of the rules of society, right? So the people with the most money can create what they want, and the people who have very little can't really do very much. And so the sort of fantasy hopefulness of it is kind of depleted by this way that it ends up reproducing the socioeconomic realities of the day, in particular of the last 10 years, right? Where we're really seeing increasing financial precarity for a lot of people. Bach does case studies in these two different environments in Second City. The first is Median City, which is set in a chaotic post-apocalyptic future of the 21st century, and has grown out of the story of a former leper colony and nuclear test site called Median, which has been almost forgotten by the surrounding world, preoccupied by the aftermath of yet another world war. So that's the sort of backstory for the place. It's kind of dystopian fantasy, which is important for us to think about, right? Is like utopias and in their relationship to dystopia, right? That these things kind of often overlap and interrelate, especially in the world of gaming. So what she finds is that the de facto leader of Median City, Jade Steele, who establishes its original protocols, was overthrown and replaced by a group of sim admins. So according to Bach, this did not create more democracy or a better user experience, but rather more rigid playing structures and bureaucracy run by the admins. So this is the space where she's thinking about like some of our earlier questions from the first week about whether or not collective spaces are necessarily democratic, right? Are participatory cultures functionally more democratic by nature? And so what she's kind of coming to the conclusion of is no, right? It created more bureaucracy and more of a concentration of power, even though theoretically it was held by more people. This is something that we want to be thinking about when we're thinking about all of our questions about participatory culture, right? One more time. Is it necessarily democratic? Is there anything about the idea that like just because it's something that happens as a participatory project of many people as opposed to just a few, does that necessarily make it more democratic? And the assumption here, or the assertion here of this study is that no, that within these confines of a non-democratic system, just having more people present does not make it more democratic by nature. The second site that she looks at is Gore. So Gorean role play in Second Life. It has its origin in the author John Norman's science fiction novels, The Chronicles of Gore. It's sadomasochistic by design. And Bach has some key findings on Gore. She said that Gore is in role play presents itself as voluntary, but actually there are power games that happen in these spaces, and the line between what is role play and what is real is very ambiguous and led to some psychological and emotional distress. Importantly, also the fantasies that were created in Gore recreated a lot of the hierarchies in real life. So plays on race and gender and class-based inequalities in particular. So relatedly, for our second rating, we have some questions about how people of marginalized identities end up experiencing massively multiplayer online role-playing games, and how gamers of marginalized identities, particularly Black queer gamers, are navigating some of that role-playing and how it can be improved for them. So this second rating is by Kishona L. Gray, and she's technically at the University of Kentucky, but is currently the Martin Luther King Jr. Visiting Scholar at MIT. In 2020, she just published a book called Intersectional Tech, Black Users in Digital Gaming. And a lot of that book is built on some of the preliminary research that's in the article that you guys have today called Gaming Out Online, Black Lesbian Identity Development and Community Building in Xbox Live. And this is from the Journal of Lesbian Studies. So in this article, Dr. Gray follows gamers of color, who she calls gamers spelled with a Y, in a community of Xbox Live, and she conceptualizes the digital and offline spaces as connected and affecting one another, not unrelated to what we were just talking about with gore. So she's looking at how racialized and gendered identities are performed, and how people can navigate things like anonymity and the ability to um, choose different personas in online role-playing game spaces. Her methodology, important for you guys to think about as you are approaching your own research coming up to the end of the semester, is a mix of ethnographic and qualitative. So what that means is she's primarily doing a mix of participant observation. So she's watching people in these spaces. She's also doing some qualitative interviews, but she's primarily observing behaviors and interviewing users about their experiences in these spaces. So Dr. Gray brings an explicitly intersectional lens to the study of gaming, and I posted for you guys a really good short video explaining what intersectionality really means, because I think it's a buzzword that you guys are probably hearing pretty often, and some of you may or may not already be familiar with what that means and what intersectional means just quickly. But I really recommend you check out that full article, the full video, which goes into much greater detail about where it comes from and its foundation in law by a researcher named Kimberly Crenshaw. But the concept of intersectionality suggests that somebody who belongs to multiple marginalized identities, that their experiencers are not simply like adding one marginalized experience to another marginalized experience, but that the way that they intersect actually creates a different experience for that person than either of those two things added together would. And so one of the ways she's talking about this is she's noting that with Black lesbians, there are clear differences of experience between, for instance, butch and femme users. So this means not only are we looking at like the intersection of Black and queer gamers, but also those who experience and represent gender identity norms in different ways. So she's seeing some distinctions in how that plays out, and that butch lesbians or butch lesbians will tend to pass less and are therefore more often noted to be part of the queer community. And she argues that Black lesbians of Xbox Live create their own community, and that is often at odds with the dominant community of these gaming spaces. So there's some degree of like community building in that is positive, but that it is also always in some kind of tension with the sort of dominant modes and consensus narratives of the spaces, which are, as we all know, and as our other film for the week, GTFO, indicates, that these are typically white male spaces, and that there's a lot of antagonism that happens of women players, and of course, for Kishona's work, specifically queer Black women players. So kind of related to the context in which Dr. Kishona Gray is looking at Black queer gamers' experiences and why they need to produce spaces of identity and community within traditional, massively multiplayer role-playing games online. We have the film GTFO, which is a documentary about Gamergate. Content warning for this one. It's really important that you guys watch it, but I also understand that some of you may find this upsetting. There is a lot of threats of violence and some really graphically awful things said to women in the documentary that have been obviously like reproduced, right? So there's a lot to hear in there that can be pretty upsetting. And a note on this too is like I'm giving you guys this documentary as a kind of context for the gaming culture and community that Dr. Gray is looking at her subjects existing in. But GTFO is notably not intersectional, right? So if you go and you think about how that intersectionality works, like you'll notice that this is not necessarily the most intersectional representation of women in these spaces. Women tend to be kind of monolith and then represented by some of the most visible people that were part of Gamergate, who were white women. So this doesn't mean that this is like a failed project. It has some important value, but it is notably lacking that intersectional lens. So just thinking about those things together might be helpful. And then lastly, as we already talked a little bit about at other points in the lecture, You have the film Utopia 1.0 by Annie Berman, who is looking at um, Second Life and kind of it's like the ghost towns of Life after so many people have abandoned it. And again, this ties in with so many of the things we talked about early on about the hopeful expectations of the kind of utopian realities of online communities, whether that's the internet, social media, or in this case, alternate reality role playing spaces. And this, will come up for us many times. So anyway, just hope you enjoy this one. You'll notice at the end that she's talking to Marissa. Marissa Holmes is one of our PhD candidates in my department. And when she's talking to Marissa, she's actually not talking about the breakdown of Second Life at that point. She's talking about kind of like what it feels like after another utopian practice, because Marissa was one of the key organizers for Occupy Wall Street. And so this is a sort of story about what happens after the fact of that, right? Like when this is over. So thinking about how we engage in the hope of utopias and what happens when they end. So great. I hope that this is an interesting week for you guys. Do make sure that you are thinking about this stuff when you're working on your discussion posts. Again, you guys have been doing really great. A lot of you have been giving me more media stuff, and that's been really helpful. Definitely start practicing that more often than not. If you have experiences in online gaming spaces that you want to talk about, or there's things that you see that either are supported by or maybe suggest some kind of something missing in the readings that we're talking about this week, please do mention that. I'm curious to hear you guys always using our readings as a way to engage spaces that you're in. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you guys soon. I'm really curious to see what you guys put on the discussion board about this topic this week. I am personally not much of a role play gamer, but I'm really curious to hear how you guys are experiencing it, if this is something that you participate in. All right. Thanks. Have a good week, guys.